I let my arrogant brothers steal our father's business. One hidden clause destroyed their lives. Are you absolutely sure about this, Caleb? The local attorney asked, his pen hovering uncertainly over the thick stack of legal documents. Across the polished mahogany table, my two older brothers, Arthur and Vance, practically vibrated with barely concealed greed. They wore bespoke suits that probably cost more than my entire rusted-out pickup truck, and their eyes were fixed on the tip of that pen like a pair of starved wolves watching a wounded calf. I'm sure, I said, my voice quiet, playing the part of the beaten down, exhausted youngest brother to absolute perfection. I reached out, took the heavy brass pen, and signed my name. With 3 strokes of ink, I signed away my rights to the most lucrative commercial properties in our family's portfolio, accepting nothing but the debt-ridden, failing dirt farm in exchange. Arthur leaned back, exhaling a long breath, while Vance allowed a razor-thin smile to touch his lips. They thought they had just pulled off the inheritance heist of the century. They had no idea they had just walked into a financial slaughterhouse. To understand how we ended up in that stuffy, leather-scented conference room in downtown Des Moines, you have to understand the Miller family dynamic. Our father, Richard Miller, was a man of the earth, a stubborn Iowa farmer who had spent 70 years pulling a living out of the soil. But he was also a shrewd businessman who had, decades ago, invested in a small commercial strip mall and a sprawling industrial warehouse on the edge of the city, while the farm, 400 acres of corn and soybeans, was his heart. The commercial properties were his cash cow. They generated a steady, handsome monthly revenue that kept the tractors running when the crops failed. Arthur and Vance had abandoned the dirt the second they received their high school diplomas. Arthur went to Chicago, climbing the corporate ladder to become a vice president at a logistics firm. Vance headed east to New York, swimming in the cutthroat waters of private equity. They viewed the farm with open disdain and viewed our father as a relic of a bygone era. They visited maybe twice in 5 years, usually just to complain about the smell of manure or the lack of decent espresso in town. I was the one who stayed. I didn't stay out of a lack of ambition. I stayed because I loved the land, and more importantly, I loved my dad. For the last 3 years of his life, as Parkinson's disease slowly dismantled his strong, capable body, I was his sole caretaker. My life became a grueling blur of managing the farm hands, tracking fluctuating crop prices, and timing Dad's medication. I bathed him, fed him, and sat awake with him during the long, terrifying nights when his lungs betrayed him. During those 3 years, Arthur and Vance contributed nothing but occasional, patronizing phone calls advising me to put the old man in a home. When Dad finally passed away on a cold Tuesday in November, the grief hollowed me out. But Arthur and Vance didn't miss a beat. The dirt on his grave was barely settled before they descended upon Iowa, bringing with them a slick, aggressive estate lawyer from Chicago named Sterling. Dad's will was straightforward. The estate was to be divided equally among his 3 sons. But Arthur and Vance had no intention of splitting the commercial real estate, nor did they want any part of the farm's operating losses. They requested an emergency mediation session, which brought us to that mahogany table. Look, Caleb, we're trying to be practical here, Arthur had said, adjusting his silk tie, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. The farm has operated at a net loss for the last 3 years. It carries a heavy mortgage. Vance and I have reviewed the books. If we liquidate the estate and split everything a third each, you'll be forced to sell the farmhouse just to cover your share of the capital gains and the outstanding agricultural loans. We're actually doing you a favor, little brother, Vance chimed in, leaning forward. You love that old house. You love playing in the dirt. We get it. So, Arthur and I are willing to take on the burden of the commercial properties. We'll take Miller Crossing and the warehouse. You take the farm, the house, and the equipment. We'll even sign over our shares of the farm's equity so you own it free and clear, subject to the existing mortgage. You get to keep your home. It was a masterclass in manipulation. They were framing the theft of a commercial portfolio generating hundreds of thousands of dollars a year as an act of brotherly charity. The commercial properties were valued at roughly $4 million. The farm, burdened by a recent series of bad harvests and a ballooning machinery loan, was appraised at maybe $1 million, but its debt profile made it a liability on paper. I had sat there, staring at my calloused hands, letting silence stretch out. I let them see the fear in my eyes, the fear of losing the only home I'd ever known. I let them think I was intimidated by their sharp suits, their aggressive Chicago lawyer, and their fast-talking financial jargon. "If I sign," I murmured, my voice perfectly pitched to sound defeated, "you guys take all the commercial assets? Everything in town?" "Everything," Sterling, their lawyer, confirmed smoothly, sliding the settlement agreement across the table. "You retain sole ownership of the 400 acres of agricultural land, the primary residence, and all associated debts of that specific parcel. Arthur and Vance will assume total ownership, and all associated liabilities of the commercial real estate." That was the magic phrase. All associated liabilities. "All right," I said, putting pen to paper. When the meeting concluded, Arthur clapped me on the shoulder. A gesture so devoid of genuine affection it felt like a slap. "You made the right choice. Caleb, leave the complex business stuff to us. You just focus on your tractors." They walked out of the office, practically glowing with the thrill of victory. I watched their rented Mercedes pull away from the curb, and instead of feeling defeated, a profound, icy calm settled over me. I got into my truck and drove back to the empty farmhouse. I went straight to Dad's study, a room smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. Behind his heavy oak desk was a floor safe. I spun the dial, pulled the heavy steel door open, and lifted out a thick manila folder. I sat in his worn leather chair and spread the documents across the desk. My father was an uneducated man, but he was far from stupid. 6 months before he died, he had received a certified letter from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. The strip mall, Miller Crossing, had housed a dry cleaning business for 35 years. It turned out that the previous owner of that dry cleaner had been illegally dumping perchloroethylene, a highly toxic, carcinogenic chemical known as PCE, straight into the drainage ditch behind the building for decades. Dad had quietly hired an independent environmental firm to conduct a Phase 2 environmental site assessment. The results, buried in this folder, were apocalyptic. The chemical plume had seeped deep into the groundwater, contaminating not only the soil beneath the strip mall, but also migrating toward the city's municipal water supply. Under the EPA's CERCLA law, the Superfund Act, environmental liability is strict, joint, and several. It doesn't matter if you didn't dump the chemicals yourself. If your name is on the deed, you are on the hook for the cleanup. The preliminary estimate to remediate the soil and groundwater at Miller Crossing wasn't thousands of dollars. It was roughly $6 million. Furthermore, the city was preparing to condemn the old warehouse next door due to structural failures, requiring a mandatory, code-compliant demolition that would cost another $500,000. The commercial properties weren't a cash cow. They were a ticking time bomb of federal liability and catastrophic debt. Dad had told me everything one late night, his hands shaking as he held the environmental report. "They're going to come for it, Caleb," he had wheezed, his eyes fierce. "When I'm gone, Arthur and Vance are going to swoop in like buzzards. They think we're just dumb hicks. They won't do their due diligence. They'll just see the rent checks and get blinded by the dollar signs. Let them take it. Let them take the town properties." But that was only half the trap. I reached back into the safe and pulled out a second, much thinner folder. This one bore the logo of the State Department of Transportation, alongside the letterhead of a massive, multinational tech conglomerate. While the farm had been losing money on crops, its location had suddenly become the most valuable piece of geography in the county. The state had quietly approved the expansion of the I-80 interstate bypass, a massive infrastructure project designed to reroute heavy commercial traffic. The newly approved interchange was slated to cut directly through the barren north pasture of our farm. But it wasn't just the state. The tech conglomerate was secretly acquiring land to build a massive, multi-billion-dollar data center. They needed 3 things: proximity to a major fiber optic backbone, a new interstate interchange for logistics, and access to a massive underground aquifer for their cooling towers. Our farm sat perfectly on top of all 3. Dad had signed an ironclad non-disclosure agreement months ago. Included in the folder was a preliminary option contract. The tech company wasn't offering agricultural prices for the dirt. They were offering commercial development rates. $45,000 an acre, plus a massive premium for the water rights. The total buyout package was hovering around $22 million. Dad had left it all to me. He had orchestrated the perfect final play. A brutal test of character for his 3 sons. If Arthur and Vance had shown up, if they had grieved, if they had offered to share the burden fairly, I would have told them everything. I would have shown them the EPA letters. I would have shared the tech company buyout. Instead, they brought a shark lawyer and tried to leave me with what they thought was a bankrupt farm. They had eagerly, voluntarily signed legal documents assuming all associated liabilities of the commercial properties to ensure I couldn't claim a dime of the rent money. I poured myself a glass of Dad's cheap bourbon, raised it to the empty room, and waited. The hammer fell exactly 7 months later. I was on the porch, watching a crew of surveyors from the tech company taking measurements in the distance, when my cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed Vance's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello," I said mildly. "Caleb." Vance's voice was unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant Wall Street tone was completely gone, replaced by a shrill, breathless panic. "Caleb, what the hell is going on? Did Dad know? Did he know about the dry cleaner?" "What dry cleaner?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "The EPA? Caleb, the feds just raided the leasing office. They slapped a massive lien on the strip mall and the warehouse. They're talking about groundwater contamination. Millions of dollars. Caleb, millions. They froze our holding company accounts this morning to secure the preliminary remediation costs." I could hear Arthur in the background, shouting something frantic about bankruptcy and piercing the corporate veil. Because they had rushed the transfer to avoid probate delays. They had signed personal guarantees on the restructured commercial loans to pay the Chicago lawyers exorbitant fees. "That sounds terrible, Vance," I said, leaning back in my rocking chair. "But you guys told me to leave the complex business stuff to you. You have to help us." Vance pleaded, his voice cracking. "We're going to lose everything. My equity firm is going to fire me if I file for bankruptcy. Arthur's house in Chicago is being used as collateral for the holding company, the farm. Caleb, you can take out an agricultural loan against the farm's equity. You have to wire us cash to retain environmental lawyers." "I can't do that, Vance," I replied, watching a heavy piece of earth-moving equipment roll across the north pasture. "Why not?" he screamed. "Because I don't own the farm anymore," I said smoothly. "I sold it last week. Or, well, I sold the land. I kept the house. A tech company bought the acreage for a data center. Eminent domain and corporate buyout. I think the final wire transfer was for $22 million? Something like that." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a man's entire reality shattering into a million jagged pieces. You sold the dirt," Vance whispered, the words barely making it past his throat. "Turns out it wasn't just dirt," I said softly. "It was Dad's legacy, and he made sure it went exactly where it was supposed to." "Caleb, please." Arthur's voice was on the phone now, weeping. Actual, genuine weeping. "We're your brothers. We're family. You lost the right to use that word the day you brought a lawyer to our father's funeral," I said. I didn't wait for a response. I pressed the red button, ending the call, and then I blocked both of their numbers. I set the phone down on the porch railing and took a deep breath of the crisp Iowa air. The scent of turned soil was rich and sweet. Out in the distance, the construction crews were beginning to lay the groundwork for a new future. I picked up my coffee, walked back inside my paid-off house, and started planning the rest of my life.